He had $43 left. $43, and a daughter who still believed everything was fine. $38.19. He'd done that math 100 times this month, and he was about to do it again. In that parking lot, he made a promise he had no idea how to keep. Nobody knew the man in the gray hoodie was worth $11 billion, and nobody knew he'd just seen something that reminded him of his own father. He didn't know it yet, but Daniel Cole's life was about to change, because one stranger refused to look away. Daniel Cole had exactly $43 in his checking account, a resume with a 2-year gap he could never fully explain, and a 7-year-old daughter who was waiting for him outside her school. With a backpack that had a broken zipper, he still hadn't found the money to fix. If you have ever stood in a parking lot doing math in your head, rent against groceries, groceries against the electric bill, you already know how this story begins. And if it grips you even a little, do me a favor and hit that like button and subscribe before we go any further, because you are going to want to see how far a father will go and what one little girl is about to do that no adult in this story saw coming. Daniel used to be somebody. 6 years ago, he was a mid-level project engineer at a firm that built commercial water systems, the kind of job that let him take his wife Sarah to dinner on Fridays and put a little away every month for a house with a yard. Then Sarah got sick. It happened fast, faster than the doctors expected, faster than Daniel's savings could survive. He spent everything. He sold the car. He sold his grandfather's watch. And at the end of 14 months, he buried his wife on a gray Tuesday in March and came home to a 5-year-old girl named Mia, who kept asking when Mommy was coming back from the hospital. Grief doesn't pay bills, but it does cost you your job, eventually, if it goes on long enough. Daniel missed too many mornings. He fell behind on a project. He was let go with a severance check that lasted exactly 9 weeks. After that came a string of jobs that never quite held. A warehouse shift that conflicted with school pickup. A delivery route that dried up when the company restructured. A construction gig that ended when the contractor's checks started bouncing. 2 years became a hole in his resume that made hiring managers' eyes slide right past his name. 26 months. That's how long it had been since Daniel Cole had a job that lasted longer than a season. On the Tuesday, this story really begins. Daniel picked Mia up from Lakeview Elementary the way he did every day, and she climbed into the passenger seat of his 15-year-old Honda and immediately started talking, the way 7-year-olds do, about a substitute teacher and a boy named Tyler, who ate paste and a school fundraiser that needed $12 by Friday for a t-shirt. Daniel said, "We'll figure it out, baby," which was the sentence he said more than any other sentence in his life, and which he was getting tired of hearing himself say. They stopped at the grocery store on the way home, and Daniel did the thing he always did. Walked the aisles with a mental calculator running, put back the good bread for the cheap bread, skipped the yogurt Mia liked in favor of the store brand, and at the register held his breath while the total rang up, because $43 doesn't leave room for a surprise. It came to $38.19. He exhaled. Mia didn't notice any of it. Kids rarely do, until they do. What Daniel didn't know, what nobody in that grocery store knew, was that the man standing 2 registers over, buying a single bottle of sparkling water and a protein bar, was Marcus Whitfield, the founder and CEO of Ashford Dynamics, a logistics and infrastructure company worth $11 billion. Marcus wasn't supposed to be there. He ducked out of a downtown board meeting to clear his head, driven nowhere in particular, and ended up at a grocery store in a neighborhood his security detail would have flagged as unnecessary exposure. He was alone, in a gray hoodie, looking like exactly nobody, which was precisely how he liked it once or twice a year. Marcus noticed Daniel not because of anything dramatic, but because of something small. He watched a man in a stained work jacket carefully return a loaf of bread to the shelf and replace it with a cheaper one. Watched him do quiet math with his eyes as items scanned. Watched him crouch down afterward and tell his daughter with real warmth that they were going to make grilled cheese tonight the good way, with the crispy edges, like it was a treat instead of what it actually was. Marcus recognized something in that. He had grown up the son of a diesel mechanic in Ohio, and there had been years he didn't talk about in interviews, when his own mother had done that same quiet math at that same kind of register. Marcus almost let it go. He almost walked to his car and drove back to his boardroom and forgot about it. The way successful people learn to forget about the 100 small tragedies they pass every day, because you cannot fix all of them, and guilt is not a strategy. But then Mia looked up at her father in the parking lot and said, loud enough for Marcus to hear as he passed, "Daddy, are we going to be okay?" And Daniel knelt down in that parking lot, took his daughter's face in his hands, and said, "Baby, I promise you, I am going to fix this. I don't know how yet, but I promise." Marcus stopped walking. He stood by his car for a long moment, watching the two of them get into their old Honda, and something in him, some memory of his own father saying nearly the same words in a driveway 30 years ago, made a decision. He didn't approach them that day. He wasn't the kind of man who inserted himself into strangers' lives on impulse, and he'd learned the hard way that grand gestures toward strangers usually said more about the giver's ego than the receiver's need. Instead, he did what he was good at. He found out who Daniel Cole was. It took his assistant, Renata, less than 2 days. Daniel Cole, 38, civil and water systems engineer, laid off during a documented family medical crisis. Strong technical background. 0 red flags beyond an employment gap that any honest HR algorithm would have filtered out automatically. Marcus read the file twice. Ashford Dynamics happened to be 3 weeks into a search for a site infrastructure manager for a new logistics hub. A real position with real responsibilities, not a job invented out of pity. Marcus told himself that mattered. He needed to believe it mattered, because the alternative was that he was about to hand a stranger a 6-figure job because of a sentence he'd overheard in a parking lot. And even billionaires need to feel like their decisions are rational. The interview was arranged through normal channels, an email from HR, a scheduled time, nothing that told Daniel a CEO had ever seen his face. Daniel almost didn't go. He'd been burned before by companies that interviewed him, seemed impressed, and then went quiet for reasons he was never given. He put on his one good shirt, the collar slightly frayed at the edges where he'd ironed it too many times, and he told Mia he had a very important meeting, and she solemnly told him to be brave, Daddy, like Simba, and that got him through the door. The interview happened in a glass conference room on the 31st floor of the Ashford Dynamics Tower, and Daniel was 3 questions in, walking a panel of 2 directors and an HR manager through how he'd redesigned a municipal water pressure system to survive a 50-year flood event. When the door opened and Marcus Whitfield walked in, nobody in the room expected him. The directors stood up so fast, one of them knocked over a water glass. Marcus waved them back down, apologized for the interruption, said he was just passing through and heard something interesting, and sat quietly at the end of the table. Daniel had no idea who he was. Marcus Whitfield rarely appeared in press photos and dressed, that day, like any other employee. Daniel simply kept talking, because stopping wasn't an option when rent was due in 9 days. Marcus asked one question near the end. He asked Daniel what he would do in his first 90 days if hired. Daniel, who had prepared for exactly this question during 3 sleepless nights, answered with specifics. Which systems he'd audit first, which vendor contracts he suspected were bleeding money, how he'd rebuild trust with a maintenance crew that internal notes suggested was demoralized. It wasn't a rehearsed pitch. It was a plan. Marcus watched him with the particular stillness of a man doing math in his head. And at the end of the interview, he stood, shook Daniel's hand, and said only, "Thank you for your time," which told Daniel absolutely nothing. 2 days later, Daniel got the call. Site infrastructure manager, Ashford Dynamics. Salary that made him sit down on his kitchen floor. Benefits that covered dental, which mattered more than anyone who has never gone 18 months without a dentist can understand. He picked Mia up that afternoon and told her, and she screamed so loud in the parking lot that a woman 2 cars over dropped her keys. For 6 weeks, everything was good, genuinely, uncomplicatedly good, in a way Daniel had almost forgotten was possible. He was sharp at work. His new manager, a woman named Priya, who ran operations for the Western Hub, told him twice in 1 month that his instincts on infrastructure risk were the best she'd seen in 5 years. Daniel started sleeping through the night. He fixed the zipper on Mia's backpack. He put $100 into a savings account for the first time in 2 years and didn't touch it, even when it was tempting. Then, in week 7, the whispers started. It began with a comment from a coworker named Greg, said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Must be nice, having Whitfield walk you straight into the building." Daniel laughed it off. Assumed Greg was just needling the new guy, but then it happened again, in the break room, from someone else. "Word is, the boss handpicked you personally. Kind of skipped the whole process, didn't you?" Daniel started noticing things he hadn't noticed before. A director who used to loop him into planning calls now CCing him after decisions were made. An invitation to a strategy retreat that quietly stopped coming. Priya's warmth cooling by a few careful degrees, as if she, too, had heard something and was recalibrating how much credit Daniel actually deserved. The story spreading through Ashford Dynamics, as Daniel eventually pieced together, was that Marcus Whitfield had personally installed a nobody off the street into a management position. No real vetting, some kind of charity project, or, worse, in the version that traveled fastest, a personal favor of an entirely different nature nobody was willing to say out loud. It didn't matter that it wasn't true. Office rumors rarely require truth. They only require a vacuum, and Marcus's unexplained appearance in that interview room had left exactly that. By week 9, Daniel was drowning in a different way than before. Not financially. The money was still coming, still real. But in every other way that mattered. He second-guessed every decision he made, wondering if his team was quietly attributing his competence to favoritism instead of skill. He stopped speaking up in meetings. He started arriving earlier and leaving later, not to get ahead, but to prove, to people who mostly weren't watching, that he belonged there. He came home some nights so hollowed out that Mia would climb into his lap and just sit with him, not talking, the way kids do when they can feel something is wrong, even if they can't name it. The breaking point came at the company's fall gala, an event Priya had insisted Daniel attend so people can see who you actually are outside a spreadsheet. Marcus was there. Daniel was there in a rented suit that fit almost right. And Mia was there too, because Daniel's usual sitter had canceled, and Priya had told him, kindly, to just bring her. Nobody minds a well-behaved 7-year-old at these things. Mia wore a purple dress with a hem Daniel had sewn himself the night before. Badly, but with enough patience that it held. Somewhere between the shrimp cocktail and the second round of small talk Daniel could barely follow, he overheard 2 directors near the bar, half drunk on complimentary wine, saying his name in the same sentence as Marcus Whitfield's, in a way that made his stomach turn. He didn't hear all of it. He didn't need to. He excused himself, found a quiet corner near the windows, and stood there with his jaw tight, wondering, really wondering, for the first time, if he should just quit before this got any worse, before Mia had to watch her father unravel in yet another job, before the whispers turned into something that followed him even after Ashford Dynamics. That was when Mia found him. She had been sitting at a table nearby, swinging her feet, half listening to the adults around her the way kids do, mostly bored, occasionally catching a word that meant something. She'd heard the directors too, or at least heard enough. The word favor, the word handpicked, a tone she recognized, because kids always recognize the tone even when they don't fully understand the words. She walked over to her father, tugged his sleeve, and asked him quietly, "Daddy, why does everyone think Mr. Whitfield just gave you the job because he felt bad for us?" Daniel didn't have an answer that wouldn't scare her, so he said nothing, which of course told her everything. And this is the part of the story nobody at Ashford Dynamics expected, least of all Marcus, who happened to be standing close enough, near a pillar with a glass of water he wasn't really drinking, to hear what happened next. Mia turned around, walked directly up to the small circle of directors near the bar, the same ones who had been talking about her father minutes earlier, and, with the fearless, unfiltered clarity that only a 7-year-old possesses, said, "My daddy didn't get his job because Mr. Whitfield felt sorry for us. He got it because Mr. Whitfield saw him put bread back on a shelf so I could have milk. And then Mr. Whitfield went and checked if my daddy was actually good at his job before he hired him. My daddy studies water pipes at night on his computer even when he's tired. He's not somebody's charity. He's just really good, and it makes me mad that you're being mean about it." The circle went dead silent. One of the directors actually set his wine glass down like it had suddenly become too heavy to hold. And Marcus Whitfield, who had never told a single person at that company the real reason he'd walked into that interview room, stood by the pillar with his jaw working because a 7-year-old in a hand-sewn purple dress had just said, out loud, in front of his entire leadership team, the exact unvarnished truth he himself had never had the nerve to explain. Marcus set his glass down and walked over. He crouched down to Mia's height, the way you do for a child, and asked her gently how she knew about the bread. Mia told him she'd seen her dad do it that day at the grocery store. She just hadn't known anyone else had seen it, too. Marcus looked up at Daniel, who was standing there with his face doing something complicated between shame and disbelief. And Marcus said, loud enough for the directors still standing frozen nearby to hear every word, "Your daughter's right. I watched you put that bread back before I ever knew your name. I checked your work history because I don't gamble on people. I checked it because I don't gamble on my company. You got this job because you're good at it. Everything else people have been whispering is noise, and I should have shut it down myself 6 weeks ago instead of letting it fester. That's on me, not you." He turned to the directors. For the record, since apparently it needs to be said out loud, by a second grader at my own company's gala, Daniel Cole was hired on merit after a full technical interview because his qualifications matched a real, open position better than anyone else's in our pipeline. I sat in on one interview because something about him reminded me of my own father, and I wanted to see for myself. That's the whole story. If anyone here has a problem with a man supporting his daughter alone, while also being excellent at his job, that's a problem I'd like to discuss with you personally, tomorrow, in my office. Nobody said a word. Priya, standing a few feet away, looked at Daniel with something like relief and something like guilt, and later that night she apologized to him quietly, admitting she'd let the rumors color how she treated him, and that it wasn't fair, and it wouldn't happen again. Daniel knelt down and hugged his daughter so tightly she squeaked, right there in the middle of the gala, not caring who saw. He told her, later in the car, that what she'd done was one of the bravest things he'd ever seen anyone do, and Mia, already half asleep against the window, mumbled, "I just told the truth, Daddy. That's not brave. That's just easy." But it wasn't easy, not really, not for a 7-year-old to stand up to a room full of adults, and not for a man who'd spent 2 years believing the world had quietly decided he wasn't worth investing in. Something shifted after that night. The whispers didn't just fade. Marcus made sure of it, addressing the interview publicly at the next all-hands meeting in a way that turned an office scandal into an office legend. The CEO, who hired a man because he watched him choose his daughter's milk over his own bread. In the months that followed, Daniel didn't just keep his job. He thrived in it, the way people do when the weight of suspicion is finally lifted off their shoulders and they're allowed to simply be good at what they do. He led the Western Hub's infrastructure audit, found nearly $2 million in vendor waste that had gone unnoticed for years, and by spring was promoted to regional director. A title that came with an office that had an actual door and a salary that let him finally stop doing grocery store math in his head. He and Marcus never became close friends. Exactly. The gap between a billionaire CEO and a single father from the infrastructure floor doesn't fully close just because of one honest night. But something real passed between them all the same. Marcus made it a quiet habit to check in with Daniel every few months, not as a boss checking on an employee, but almost like a man checking on a piece of his own history he'd been given a chance to rewrite. And every year, at the company's fall gala, Marcus made sure Mia had a seat at the table, because, as he told Daniel once, only half joking, that kid has better instincts than half my board. As for Mia, she never fully understood, not for years, how much that one sentence at a gala had changed her family's life. To her, it was simple. Someone was being unfair to her dad, and she said so. That was the whole of it. The entire moral architecture of a 7-year-old who hadn't yet learned that adults sometimes let unfairness slide because confronting it feels harder than it is. She hadn't learned that lesson, and if Daniel had anything to say about it, she never would. Years later, when Mia was old enough to understand the full weight of what had happened that autumn night, Daniel told her the whole story, the layoffs, the debt, the promise he'd made in a grocery store parking lot with no idea how he'd keep it, the interview he'd almost skipped, the whispers that had nearly driven him to quit the best job he'd ever had. He told her it wasn't Marcus Whitfield who had saved them that year. Not really. It was her. A little girl in a hand-sewn purple dress who didn't know the difference between what you're supposed to say in a room full of important people and what's simply true, and who chose the truth anyway. If this story moved you even a little, remember there's someone out there right now doing quiet math in a grocery store aisle, putting the good bread back so someone else can have milk, promising a child everything will be okay without knowing exactly how. Sometimes it takes a stranger noticing. Sometimes it takes a child saying what the adults are too careful to say. And sometimes it just takes one person refusing to give up on a promise made in a parking lot. Like this video, subscribe for more stories like Daniel and Mia's, and tell us in the comments. What's the bravest thing a child in your life has ever said out loud?